Hello, welcome to the very first book Sandwiched In for 2021. My name is Rory Martorana. I'm a reference and adult services librarian at the New Haven Free Public Library. We have with us today Haley Shapley, and she's the author of Strong Like Her, a celebration of rule breakers, history makers, and unstoppable athletes. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited about this because I'm a big fitness nut. So did you had some things that you were ready to share first?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, just thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I've been learning more about your library over the past few weeks, and you have some amazing programming going on. So I'm honored to be a part of it and glad to spend a lunch break with all of you. So thank you for having me. And just for a little backstory about me, I'm a journalist. I've been a writer or an editor for my entire career, primarily a travel writer for a long time. So when I came to the idea for Strong Like Her, it was a bit of a departure from things that I had done in the past, but it was really both personally and professionally compelling for me, which I think is important when you're going to do a big project like write a book, because I was very immersed in it for a long time, and I still am today as I get the chance to talk to people about the book. So I thought I would start by just giving you all a little bit of background about how I came to the idea of Strong Like Her, and then we can go into some Q&A about the topics in the book. So I've got some visuals to share here. Oh, it says the host has disabled participant screen sharing, which I just noticed.
Oh, we can get that.
Great. Okay, so this sort of journey all started about 4 or 5 years ago when I signed up for a bodybuilding show. And that was not something that I ever thought that I would do. I had never wanted to be very muscular. It wasn't a goal of mine. And the idea of standing on stage in high heels and a bathing suit was kind of my idea of a nightmare. It was not the type of thing that I was excited about necessarily. However, I have always enjoyed setting goals and pushing my limits. So some of the challenges that I had taken on in recent years were running a marathon. I climbed Mount Rainier. I rode my bike 206 miles from Seattle to Portland. And I was really looking for something that would require a dedication to training the way that these goals had, but that would push me outside of my comfort zone a little bit more. And bodybuilding seemed to really fit the bill. So I learned a lot through the process that I think was to be expected. I learned how to weigh and measure all of my food. I learned how important sleep is to recovery. I learned all kinds of exercises for all kinds of different things. But there were some surprises along the way as well. And one of those was the way that people reacted to me. So when others found out I was training, some people would ask if they could touch me. Many people wondered aloud how it was affecting my dating life. And more people were commenting on my appearance than ever before. I was visiting home about a month before I competed when a family member told me that I looked like a man. This is what I looked like at the time. And I found it fascinating, not just because I didn't think I looked like a man, because that's not really the point. But what I realized was that we still have these ideas about what women should look like. And when you step outside the bounds of that, particularly on purpose, people have commentary. They're going to say things. But despite this attitude, I still felt like I was seeing strong women everywhere. On TV, on social media, running obstacle course races, and participating in popular events or activities like CrossFit. And so I started to become curious about how our attitudes toward muscularity have evolved over time. And so I went to one of my favorite places, the library, which some people tuning in today can probably relate to find out more about this. And I checked out a lot of books on the history of fitness. And inside those books, I found very few pages dedicated to women, particularly to strong women. And so I realized at that point there was really a wonderful opportunity to explore this history because I knew that there had been physically strong women for a long time. And I wanted to uncover those stories and see if I could find women who were perhaps pursuing strength goals before that was a socially acceptable activity, or if there were other times in history where it was really cool. So from there, I combed through many resources for the most interesting stories I could find. And in Strong Like Her, I start in ancient Greece, where women outside of Sparta didn't have much of an opportunity to play sports or, to be athletic at all. And where there was an interesting dichotomy where the men were simultaneously attracted to and repulsed by the Amazon women who had their own, who rode horseback and wore pants and led these very independent lives. And then I make a stop in ancient Rome, where this famous mosaic was unearthed that shows that women were, or girls probably in this case, were playing sports. We've got some dumbbells here and a discus. In the other images, women are running and jumping and throwing. What's interesting, I think, about this mosaic is that when it was unearthed in the 1950s, it was called the Bikini Girls because the archaeologists at the time thought that these women were wearing bikinis and perhaps participating in some kind of beauty pageant. And I think that it is clear now that they are playing sports, but because that was outside of the norms of what you would expect in the 1950s, they were looking at it through that lens. So just an interesting detour in history. But then I move on to the circus rings of the early 1900s, where this woman, Sandwina, rose to prominence for being able to lift 3 men at a time. And she was widely admired for her womanly figure. In fact, a journalist at the time wrote that her arms, which can raise 240 pounds over her head, are supple and smooth enough to project from a ball gown. No horrid lumps of muscle, dears, just a little ripple under the skin, like mice playing in a mattress. And then I make a stop on the sands of Muscle Beach, where this woman, Pudgy Stockton, was inspiring people of all genders, ages, and sizes to get stronger. And then onto the marathon courses of the 1960s, where it was rumored that a woman's uterus would fall out if she ran too far. And then in the 1970s, strength sports took off for women, but it wasn't always easy to find a spot in the weight room, as this weightlifter, Karen Marshall, discovered. And then I look at the issues of today, a world where muscularity is often seen as pretty cool for women, but in which soccer players are fighting for equitable pay and track stars like Allison Felix want fair sponsorship contracts. When I was working on Strong Like Her, it was really important to me to show that there isn't just one way to look strong or to be strong. So sprinkled throughout the chapters, you'll find these beautiful portraits by celebrity photographer Sophie Holland, whom I teamed up with, of a wide range of today's most awe-inspiring athletes, from an Olympic fencer, to a record-holding rock climber, to a prima ballerina, to a strong woman who's been named America's Strongest Woman 8 times. These women's stories touch on a lot of universal issues, including self-esteem, resilience, motherhood, body image, and so much more. Through writing Strong Like Her, I learned that physical strength isn't just one aspect of our lives. It's really tied in with all other aspects of our strength, like mental and emotional and spiritual. And the women I profiled didn't just run higher or get strong in order to run faster or jump higher, they used their strength to translate to bigger things like fighting for suffrage or conquering cancer or battling the wage gap or instilling hope during some of history's most difficult times. And I got just a little taste of that when I was trying out bodybuilding. Truthfully, there were a lot of things about it that I didn't love, but the one that I did was the empowerment that I gained from the process of building strength and building physical strength. And it led me to writing this book. So for that, I will always be grateful. So that's kind of the backstory of how Strong Like Her came to be. And I'd be happy to dive more into what the book covers. If there are any questions on that, anything related to sports and feminism and the brave women who've paved the way for us today to be able to pursue physical goals with more zeal than perhaps we could in the past.
So I wanted to start with, like, you have Meg Gallagher on the cover. That's actually how I came to found the book, because I do her bodybuilding, her weightlifting program.
Right.
But there are about 24 different athletes in that book that have those portraits and that you profiled at the end. How did you come across them, or how did you decide who to talk to, who to profile?
That's a great question. It was really complicated because I wanted to have athletes from all different sports, and I wanted to have just one who sort of represented each sport. And I wanted everyone who picked up the book to see someone who embodied a quality that reminded them of themselves or something that they would want to work towards. So I really wanted it to be a diverse collection of women. And so I just started by making a huge list of athletes who I would love to have in the book. And I made sure to prioritize certain strength-related sports because I knew I wanted to have a power lifter, an Olympic weightlifter, a strong woman, a CrossFitter, some of these sports that have been historically underrepresented for women, but that are really on the rise. I wanted to make sure to put a spotlight on some of those women. So I just started contacting people. It was really cold emailing them mostly. And I was amazed at what a great response I got from women. They seemed to get the concept of the book immediately, even though I didn't have anything to show at the time. And there was a real hunger for this kind of book out there because the women who are the women who are athletes, they've been living this. They know what it's like to be judged for what they're doing, or maybe they don't, but they know the history of the women who have come before them. So it was kind of just a big puzzle, and a lot of it came down to logistics. When you have busy athletes, finding a time to photograph them is difficult, but ultimately I worked with the photographer who knew a few of the athletes as well, because she has her specialty is shooting movement. So she has relationships with some of the women who are in the book. And we kind of just collaborated and came up with our final 23 athletes who I'm so honored to have represented.
Were they all there at the same time for the photos?
Not at the same time. I was there. There were 3 different photo shoots that we did. So it was, the energy on set was amazing though for all 3 of them, especially after the first one. I came back home after, after the photo shoot, and I was just amped to both write and to work out. I went so hard at the gym that I actually ended up straining my glute doing some lunges that were probably a little too heavy for me, because I was just like, let's go. These women are so inspirational and I have all this energy now and I'm feeling great. So I want to warn people, after you read the book, do not go out too hard.
Yeah. Oh, that must have been so fun, just having all those incredible women in one spot.
It really was. Yes, it was amazing. They were all great. And I wish I could bottle that feeling up and distribute it along with the book, because it was wonderful to have them all together, or to have many of them together at the same time.
So if anyone viewing has any questions, if you're streaming on Facebook and you type comment, it'll stream into our chat up here. And if you do have a question from the Zoom platform, you can enter that in the chat as well. I wanted to talk a little about Pudgy Stockton because she's my favorite.
Yeah, I love Pudgy.
So just like the idea, I mean, maybe you should provide some background on her, but Pudgy Stockton, her name is Abby. She was a little chubby and had the name Pudgy and sort of co-opted it and became this great weightlifter on Muscle Beach in the 40s. And I love her so much. So I was really jazzed to see that she was in the book. But you had mentioned she was saying that weightlifting is for everybody, and she said it in like the mid 40s. So why do you think it's taken so long? Like, even now, it's becoming more of a, I don't want to say trend because I hope it doesn't go away, but like weightlifting for women is becoming more popular now.
Right.
But it's still not totally accepted. Like, I haven't been in the gym since last February because of what's going on in the world. But when I used to go to the power rack, if I was alone, I would have eyes on me or men coming up and telling me, oh, they'll tell me what to do, like assuming I didn't know.
Yeah.
So why do you think it's taken so long for that to be more accepted?
That's a good question. And that is what I try to get at in the book is, why these ideas kind of come in and out of vogue, and why we look at women's strength in different ways in different eras. And so I think when Pudgy came along, it was during the Great Depression. She's on Muscle Beach. Muscle Beach was a really fascinating time in the 1930s and 40s. There was a subculture there that had a huge amount of influence on physical culture for years to come. And there were a lot of famous names that were flipping around on the beach in those times. There was Jack LaLanne, who went on to become very well known for his fitness and for selling juicers for people who watched infomercials in the 1990s. There was Vic Tanny, who's known as the father of the modern health club. There was Joe Gold, who was an early bodybuilder and who is the namesake for Gold's Gym. And there was Harold Zinkin, who invented the universal gym machine, which is still a very popular piece of equipment. So within this environment, there are also a very small handful of women who are out there and they're lifting weights and they're doing acrobatic tricks and adagio, which is when you do kind of tricks with a partner. And Pudgy Stockton I write in the book that she kind of rose to the top of this human pyramid because they love to do human pyramids on Muscle Beach. But she captivated people. She was so friendly. She looked like she was having a great time because she was having a great time. She loved being out there and moving her body. She had graduated from high school and taken a job at a telephone company as an operator. And she'd been sedentary and she started to not like the way that she was feeling. And so her boyfriend at the time, who later became her husband, Les, he recommended that she start lifting some weights and that he would put together a routine for her. And she was hesitant. She didn't know that she wanted to do that, but she had gone to try to do some research about exercise for women. And she discovered that there was not much out there, of course, back then for what women should be doing. So she decided to agree and do this routine, and she ended up loving it. And it went from there. But Pudgy, she advocated for weightlifting for everyone. She wrote a column called Barbells, with bells, with an E at the end, in Strength and Health magazine that was specifically aimed at women and giving them practical tips on how they could lift weights and incorporate strength into their routine. And this was a message that was pretty well received at the time. It wasn't necessarily something everyone was doing, but a lot of people, women especially, started to think, this is something that might be for me. I think the reason that we see that it didn't quite catch on and keep going unabated was because of World War II. So during World War II, women were holding down the home front, and they were doing a lot of jobs that men had been doing, and being strong was important for a lot of those. But I think when the war ended and life went somewhat more back to normal, there was a bigger division between men and women after that. And women went more into the domestic sphere, and it became less popular for women to pursue sports. We see kind of like sports leagues that had popped up during the 40s as well. The All-American Girls Baseball League, as featured in A League of Their Own, is a very popular example, and that kind of petered out again after the war ended. So I think there were still women lifting, of course, there were still women who were interested in that, but it went into hibernation a little bit. And that went all the way up into the 70s, which is when we see the next kind of spike in women wanting to lift weights and having more of an opportunity to do that. But there had been, even before Pudgy, in the early 1900s, there was a famous bodybuilder who was trying to get women to lift weights and was like, this is what you should be doing. And gosh, go back to ancient Sparta. And they thought women should be strong because it would produce stronger children overall if both the mom and the dad were strong. So we've had these people sort of advocating for women being strong at various points, but it doesn't always catch on for the long term.
The other interesting thing about her was, and I think you mentioned this in the book, which might have made a difference, is that she was strong. But you were talking about Sandwina and the circus and all that. And she was strong, but she was also physically very big.
Yes.
And when you were describing Pudgy Stockton, you'd said like she's strong, but in the girl next door way. So it's almost like, if you guys don't know, I pulled up her picture from the book, what she looks like. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but she was not very tall. She was petite. Yeah, she was blonde. So it's just this cute blonde girl. Like we're used to that now on Instagram is full of them that lift weights.
Yeah, I think that played a role. She's 5'2", she's 115 pounds. She's not what people expected to be a woman who lifted weights. And I mentioned Sandwina, the circus star, who was, estimates vary because in the circus, there was a lot of promotion that wasn't necessarily accurate. So it's hard to know for sure, but she was probably, 5'10" to 6 feet tall. She's over 200 pounds. She comes from a circus family where her dad was so big. His wedding ring was described as, the size of $50. And her mom had these 15-inch biceps, and all of her siblings were very strong as well. She's born in the back of a circus wagon, right? So she's just born to be strong, to be a circus performer. And people did love her, but they expected her to be strong. And it didn't necessarily seem like something they could do for themselves. It seemed like something they could watch and appreciate and marvel at. But when Pudgy did it, it suddenly seemed like, wow, this is something accessible. And this is something that I might be able to do. And so I think that was the difference. And when women started to really think that this could be an activity for them.
Yep. So we have a question from Isaac. I'm curious how you think about the difference between powerlifting and bodybuilding, why you chose bodybuilding to start, and how women in particular talk about their experiences in these many different strength building approaches, Olympic lifting, powerlifting, acrobatics, and so on.
Yeah, that's a good question. And just for people who don't know the differences between some of these strength sports, powerlifting is a sport all about how much you can lift. It has 3 lifts in it: the bench press, the deadlift, and the back squat. And the winner is the person who lifts the most weight. There are usually weight classes, and different federations run competitions maybe slightly differently, but it's all about how much can you lift. Bodybuilding, on the other hand, there are no strength requirements per se. Bodybuilders lift weights in order to develop the muscularity to then go on stage and to present a certain physique. There are different categories within bodybuilding, so there are different looks that you're going for, and different requirements for the different categories. But in general, it is an aesthetics-based sport where you're building this muscularity in order to show it in a certain way. So I definitely get this question a lot, and a lot while I was doing it. Like, why are you doing this? Everything else you've done has been really more performance-based. And I think that is, I think it's a good question. I will say I started with just general strength training. So I had been lifting weights for about 2 years before I started bodybuilding. So I had the background of weight training going into it. And I'm still interested in perhaps doing a powerlifting competition. So it's not off the table. I would have to work on my bench press a lot. That's not my strength. But the reason I chose bodybuilding was because it felt more outside of my comfort zone than something like powerlifting. I had an opportunity to do it because I had met a bodybuilding coach and had one in sort of my social circle at the time. And honestly, someone told me they didn't think that I could do it. And I love a good challenge. So when I heard that, I said, okay, game on. I am going to see if I can do this. That's kind of why I chose it. I think I interview women in the book who have participated in all of these sports. I feature a couple of bodybuilders. One is Dana Lynn Bailey, who is one of the women whose portrait is featured in the book. And the other is more of a historical bodybuilding competitor, Elaine Craig, who was competing in the 1980s primarily, and who still runs bodybuilding shows to this day. And, they both got a lot out of the sport. And they talk about it in similar ways that powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters talk about what that sport has brought to their lives. Elaine brought up a lot of good points about how she loves to see people get on stage, because once they can conquer that fear, they can conquer other fears within their lives. And I think that that is an interesting perspective. I do think that there are issues with aesthetics-based sports for sure, and I probably wouldn't compete again, but ultimately I did get a lot out of it.
So we have another question. I kind of love this. So Emily, who is a coworker, said, I'm curious what you think about current PE programs in schools. Do they do a good job of encouraging girls to be strong? What could they do differently? Asking as someone who hated gym class. And I love that, because I also hated gym class. And now I'm like, everyone calls me a jock. So what do you think, Haley?
That is a really good question. And I actually don't know a lot about PE classes in schools today. So I guess I would need to learn more about what they're doing today to answer this question for sure. I loved PE class. I'm just going to say I always did. I played a lot of sports growing up, and I loved to play sports, but I never really wanted to be stronger. And so I think this question about whether they're doing a good job of encouraging girls to be strong is an interesting one. And I have to admit, I don't know the answer, but I hope that they are. And I have a feeling that things are a little bit different than they are when I was growing up, because one of the most common comments I get is from parents telling me that their young girls love looking at the book. They love looking at the pictures of the women and saying like, I'm strong like that. That's like me. And I just think that's amazing, because I don't think when I was growing up that I would have looked at those pictures in the same way. But I think girls now are just seeing more strong women, you know, more images modeled for them, and they think it's cool to do these kind of activities. So I wish I had a better answer for that question. I should look more into what these programs are doing, but I hope that we are encouraging girls to be stronger, and I think that we are. I think puberty is where things sort of start to go sideways a little bit with
with a lot of things.
With a lot of things in general.
With STEM stuff too, with the math and the science.
Absolutely. And, you know, just with these ideas of, I don't want to be bigger. I don't want to do anything that is like, will make me stand out or make me seem masculine perhaps, or lots of things that kind of go on there. But overall, I do think that we're seeing more girls and teenagers who are interested in pursuing strength sports and don't really care what people think about it.
Oh, and Emily says that is a good answer.
Oh, good. Thank you, Emily.
So we have another question. Any thoughts on doing an international edition, looking at women and bodybuilding in Europe and other countries?
Yeah, I've gotten this question as well, usually particularly about Asia. I think people are interested in looking at that. I do think, although this book is very US focused, I talk a bit about Europe. I have a chapter on swimming that has a lot of England and Australian influences in it. And I think I had a lot of material from Germany at one point that mostly got cut out of the book, but I do think a lot of the attitudes, at least in the Victorian era, which is a time period I cover quite a bit, and then, you know, going through the mid 1900s, I think a lot of that overlaps, at least with what's going on in the UK at the time. But I do think there's definitely, Europe is a big continent. There's definitely more to explore there. I think there's a lot to explore, you know, with other areas of the world. So I do think it would be interesting. And initially I had wanted it to be more worldwide, but I realized the scope was so huge and what was going on at different time periods in different places, it wasn't necessarily comparable. So I needed to focus in a little bit more. But I do, you know, it's a possibility of looking at this on a more international level.
I'm going to go back to some of the content you covered in the book. So my interests are sort of, I got into fitness and stuff because I was pushing 250 pounds like 3 years ago, and I joined a personal training studio and realized, and I hated, up until then, I had hated everything to do with the gym. I hated everything. I hated sweating. I hated, you know, I like spent all my time in my bed, like eating food and watching TV. So, and my friend Caitlin had gotten me to join Planet Fitness with her. And honestly, it was her on the cardio machines while I sat next to her on a bike watching TV and talking. So, so people come from all different backgrounds and stuff. But I realized when I started doing it, you start feeling so good that you want to keep doing it. And I had never actually gotten to that point with exercise before. I can't remember what I was going to ask you. But the weights. So when my trainer started introducing the barbell, especially into my training programs, that's something I felt so incredible. And I'm big into superheroes and, you know, graphic novels and stuff. And so he was always like, you know, well, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, stuff like that. But it's really cool when you see yourself doing things. I remember, what was I doing? There was some exercise I was doing with the barbell. I think I was doing like rows or bus drivers or something. And he was like, remember when you couldn't even pick the bar up? And now we have all these plates on here. Like, that's so cool. So I was thinking back to the portions you were talking about with the circus, especially, and how it sort of fed into the suffragette movement. So that's a piece of history that I've always been very interested in, just as a woman. I never knew that they had such an impact on that. But do you think, I worded a question, let's see. So the parallel between them, between the circus adverts and the suffragettes, actually campaigning and actively using their voice and fighting for more agency. I wanted to talk a little bit about that and how people find their strength. See, I know I'm connected somehow.
We will, yeah, no, there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
I love your story for one. I think it's a common story, and the book profiles a lot of women who were sporty from the get-go. They were, they're elite athletes. So a lot of them have elite athletic training backgrounds, but there are plenty of women I focus on in the book who came to weight training later in life or had no idea what they were capable of. And I went through the same experience with a barbell, and I had played a lot of sports. I grew up playing basketball. I was a swimmer. I played tennis. I ran track. I did a lot of things, but I had never worked out with a barbell. And it's incredibly empowering, especially as you see those, you start adding more of those plates. It's amazing. And Meg Gallagher, who's on the cover, who you mentioned, her mission is to get a barbell in every woman's hands. And it's for those reasons, not because she wants everyone to be able to press 100 pounds over their head or whatever it is, but because of those benefits that you get from that empowerment. And so kind of tying into what you were just mentioning with suffragists in the circus, this was something that I didn't know a lot about either. But as women were fighting for the right to vote, we know a lot about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and some of these other women who were doing huge things for that movement. But some of the main supporters or the main women who were getting popular opinion to shift to women being able to vote were athletes like circus stars, because they had independence. They traveled the country, which most people didn't have a chance to do at the time. They made their own money, which most women didn't do at the time. And they were physically strong, which most women weren't at the time. And one of the arguments against women being allowed to vote was that no one should vote who you couldn't send off to war to fight for us. And then when people saw Sandwina and they saw how strong she was, that line of argument was completely busted, because you would want to follow this woman into battle. This is a woman who can take care of business. So people really admired these circus stars, and they had a measure of influence that a lot, that was hard to come by. They were celebrities basically, because when the circus came to town, everything shut down. There wasn't TV, there wasn't even radio, there wasn't a lot of entertainment options. So it was a pretty big deal when the circus came to town, and that allowed these women to exert some influence. And so they started to form groups within the circuses of like suffragist groups, and they started meeting and having campaigns and doing different things. And so they played a role in turning that tide of getting women the right to vote. And another sort of tie-in at that same time was women learning to ride a bicycle. And I explore that in the book as well, because once women learned to ride a bike, and these were everyday women, these were women from all walks of life. The bikes suddenly in the 1890s became very accessible because of developments in the way that it was structured, cost. All of these things kind of came together and allowed the bike to be something that anyone could ride. It looked an awful lot like it does today. And so once women got that little taste of independence and they could go somewhere on their own, they could get fresh air, they could get some exercise, they could go meet with friends, they suddenly wanted more. independence, and they realized, gosh, I should have a say in the way that these roads are laid out because I ride my bike on them. And so that was a big tie-in of physical fitness and a really larger cultural movement that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about.
So we have a viewer question from Caitlin. What are some ways for complete novices to get started with any sort of strength training for adults, but also what opportunities are there available for kids and teens?
Good question. I think it's obviously challenging right now with the pandemic and everything that's going on. I think when it comes to strength training, it's important, at least at the beginning, to have a trainer, a coach, somebody who's just making sure that your form is on point, because it's a very safe activity. It's much safer than people think it is because you are in control of the factors that happen versus when you're playing sports and you've got all these other people running around and you can't necessarily control what you're doing. Like, the weight room is a very controlled environment, but that doesn't mean that you can't still hurt yourself or have things go wrong, especially if you're not using proper form. So I do encourage, especially if you're going to be barbell training, getting some coaching. But I think that there are a lot of body weight things that you can do with strength, even just starting with push-ups and squats. And there's so many routines online. A lot of the women in my book offer them and offer tips on Instagram and through their social media channels on how to get started in strength training. And there are definitely opportunities for kids and teens as well. I think more people are realizing that strength is helpful for kids. We used to think that it stunted growth, and that is now not something that people, some people still believe it, but that's been debunked by studies. So as long as the kids are old enough to follow the proper instructions in order to do the movement, that's sort of you have to make sure that they can grasp what they're supposed to be doing and have the attention span to execute it properly. But as long as that's the case and they're under supervision, it is totally fine for kids to do some strength training. And I was just going to say something else about that. But I think, I'm not sure what the local resources are necessarily, but I'm sure that there are plenty around. And I definitely recommend it's never too late to get started.
No, never. Like, I started, I was 34. And I never thought I would set foot in a gym willingly and actually be looking forward to it. And now I can't get enough of it. So it's never too soon.
And there's a woman I talk about in the book who was in her 70s when she started to lift weights, and she's in her 80s now and is still loving it. And her story is so inspirational to me because she's just a regular woman who wanted to be able to lift cat litter off of a store shelf and not have to ask for help. And I just love that origin story. And I talk in the book about how I met her. I just happened to meet her in an airport on a layover. I had been in Iceland running a Spartan race, and it was just serendipity that I met her. So yes, never too late, and always a benefit, especially for women, of strength training. As you get older, you want your bone density to remain high, and strength training is the best way to do that.
That's something I've been telling my mom.
Yeah. I try too. I tried with my grandma as well. And it's interesting. My grandma's first reaction when I suggested some very light training was that she didn't want to become bulky. And I think that is something that women...
It's a generational thing, I think. Because I never hear that from people older than me.
I think that there is still some concern about being bulky. I think it depends on the women, but that is still, from what I hear, personal trainers, that's still like the number one thing that they hear from women who are resistant to weight training. And there are a few women in the book who talk about that, like Patina Miller, who was a Broadway star, was initially concerned about lifting weights because she didn't want to be bulky. So I dive into that in the book, sort of where these concerns come from, how much merit there is to them, and why that's something that has popped up among generations.
Let's see. So I wanted to talk about the gender polarization and body expectations and sort of what it's a good segue to, like, what is it about muscles on women that makes people uncomfortable? Trying to see if I can word an actual question out of this though. So you were talking in the book about the studies on how women can actually build muscle, you know, just as easily as men. It just, you know, it looks different. I'm curious why you might think, because it's not widely talked about, like there's still that stigma that, you know, you're going to get bulky. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there aren't more, not studies, but like, you know, general knowledge out there about weightlifting in general and, you know, men versus women? It always seems like men are expected, if they start weightlifting, to get bulky and strong. Like, yeah, they want you to be He-Man, but if a woman does it, it's intimidating, or, and not just to men, to other women too. Did you speak on that? I know you had written in one part, there was something about like the men set the expectation, but we're the ones who kind of uphold it. And that's really interesting to me. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, good questions in there. So I think a lot of our current ideas on muscularity in men and femininity in women go back to the 1800s. I interviewed a woman who's a psychotherapist who studied body image, and she said, you know, for most of history, masculinity has been associated with strength and muscles, while femininity has been associated with frailty. And they're polar opposites. So the more in vogue muscularity is for men, the more in vogue frailty is for women. And that was really kind of crystallized when the Industrial Revolution happened, and we got these different spheres of influence. So men got the physical sphere of influence and the provider sphere, and women got the moral sphere and the family sphere. So these were different things. And at the time, you weren't supposed to sort of cross these spheres. You were supposed to stay in your own lane and do what was prescribed for your gender. So we see that, you know, men build muscularity and women don't. And before that time, people had mostly been subsisting on their own. You know, they had their own homesteads, their own farms, they were making their own food and making their own clothes. And we don't see as big of a difference between the activities that men and women did, because everyone just pitched in and did what they could. And you didn't see this idea that women were strong as unusual, because women were strong. They were doing all of these chores. But as we see this split after the Industrial Revolution, you know, we come to associate these things like muscularity in men and frailty in women. And we still have a little bit of that today. I think the reason why people find muscles on women to be unusual or something that they think seems strange is just because we haven't seen it that much. I think the more that you see something, the more normalized it becomes. And this happened in my own life. When I first stepped foot into my weight training gym, I remember on the first day, I saw this woman who had very broad shoulders and was doing all these pull-ups, and she seemed nice and she was lovely. And I just thought to myself, that's not something that I would want for me. And 2 years later, I'm training for a bodybuilding show, trying to get that look, right? And it had totally changed my ideas of what I wanted to look like and what I thought that I was capable of. And I trace in the book a little bit about where our body expectations and social norms come from, because they change a lot more than we think they do. And I have, several factors that I think go into it, but one of those is definitely modeling and the people that you hang out with. So the more strong women you hang out with, the less strange that you think muscles will look on them. And that's why I think, as we see social media, you can find your community through different social media platforms. And so I think people are seeing more of what they want to. They're curating their the images that they see. And so we see more body types becoming acceptable because we have more representation of lots of different body types now than we did in the 80s and 90s, when we could only see what was in magazines or on TV.
It's interesting too, the study you talked about with the placebo effect with the weightlifters. I feel like that's a big part too of like the roadblocks for women and getting into strength in general is we have to get out of our heads. So just like background, and I guess Haley, you could expand on this, but they had done a study with weightlifters and what was it, like sugar pills, and saying it was going to improve their performance, and they were, breaking all of these personal records. And then once they found out it was a placebo, they suddenly couldn't do it anymore, which I'm sure we've seen in other studies and other scenarios. But that really struck me. The mind is so powerful.
Yeah, we know the mind is powerful, but when we see it in, data like that, it becomes even clearer just how powerful it is. There were a couple of studies I referenced, but I think these were competitive powerlifters. So they already had been pushing their limits. They already were training. And once they thought they had this advantage, they were able to lift even more. And after they found out this was not a real advantage, it was just sugar pills, they often slid right back to their old PRs or even lower in some cases. They were obviously capable of lifting the weight. They had just done it using sugar pills, but their minds were no longer there. And I make the argument that is at least some of the reason why women find things like pull-ups so difficult. Plenty of women are capable of doing pull-ups physically, but mentally, we just have this idea that this is not something that we can do. It's not something we've ever been able to do. We don't engage the right muscles because our minds just don't think that this is something that ultimately we can do. But now, as we see more women doing pull-ups, then I think more are realizing that they can do it. And pull-ups are still difficult, I want to say. It's not like
they're hard, but
they're still, I really struggle with pull-ups, and I think mentally that I'm there, but I also recognize that I've gotten a lot of messages throughout time that started when I was very young that I didn't have upper body strength. That was a message that I got, that women in our family don't have upper body strength. We can't do this. But I didn't get those same messages about lower body strength. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, I'm much better at squatting and deadlifting and doing things like that because I was using my legs a lot more as a kid to play sports and activities, and wasn't working with my upper body because it was always something that I thought that I didn't have.
I remember when I got my first pull-up, my trainer was like, he had his hands under my feet like this, but he wasn't touching me. And I got my first, I think I did 3 or 4 in a row. And I was like, let go, stop pushing me, I can try. And he's like, you're doing it. You're doing that. So yeah, it's like your mind. Like I didn't think that was me. I figured I only had it because there was like a dude holding me up. But no, that was me. But they are hard.
That's a very powerful metaphor right there, right?
Yeah. I probably can't do them anymore because I haven't been in the gym, but who knows? Maybe.
Fair, but you can get it back faster, right?
Yeah.
If you have it, it's much easier to rebuild.
Let's see. We have a question from Emily wondering what you're doing now to challenge yourself. Still bodybuilding competitions? I follow you on Instagram. I think you mentioned something.
Yeah, so it's very difficult right now, obviously, to have a lot of goals in general. But the one thing, and I'm not working on anything big right now. Still waiting for inspiration for my next pursuit. So I'm always open to suggestion. But one thing I started doing was learning to do the splits. So every night I've been taking an hour-long like flexibility class online, and I'm working on both my front and middle splits. It's something I've never been able to do. I think flexibility is important just as strength and cardio, endurance, power. There are all kinds of dimensions of physical fitness, and I think flexibility is one of them that I have worked on and off over the years. So that's what I'm working on, and I'm still not that close, but I'm definitely getting closer. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. In addition to, I do weight training 5 to 6 days a week, but at home with right now with dumbbells and a kettlebell and a jump rope. Just kind of really, I live in a condo, so just some pieces that are small.
Like a lot of America. I'm in a studio apartment and it has transformed into a gym.
Yeah. Mine, yeah, I definitely I've got a yoga mat out here. I'm looking at the weights right now. I had a bike in here for a while, but that was just taking up too much space. So
I have like a bench taking up my entire carpet. It's in between the love seat because I can't fit a couch, the TV. Like it's ridiculous. But thankfully, it's not like you can have people over. So it's not going to be in the way for anyone else. Right. Let's see, one more. So I'm assuming that this question is a joke because this is Seth. This is my boss. What would you recommend for a slightly overweight Jewish guy in his early 60s who wants to start bodybuilding?
I'm not a bodybuilding coach, so it's hard to say, but there are a lot of resources out there. I would find one thing that was cool was I was on a bodybuilding team. And so I had other women who I met with once a week and could talk about what we were up to, and we did posing practice together and we went to each other's shows, and so it was nice to have a community. So I would find a community, like maybe find a friend who wants to compete in a bodybuilding show too. As I mentioned, it's good to have a coach, especially for figuring out your nutrition and your exercise plan, because you do want to train for it a little bit differently than you would. Yeah, it's like any sport, there are specific things that you want to do. So I think it's cool. There are masters categories for bodybuilding. So there's usually like a 60 and up category.
Never too late. Never too late.
Never too late. There was a cool story last year in the news. Maybe it was 2019 now, actually, but about a bodybuilder in her 80s who this wasn't cool. Someone broke into her house and it wasn't cool, but she like fought him off and he was not expecting it because she was in her 80s, but you don't mess with a bodybuilder.
That's good stuff. It's like the benefits of, getting into this stuff. I like also, you mentioned a bunch of times community, and I think that's so important. And it's also kind of an ongoing strand through the book. Like Muscle Beach had the community. Actually reminds me a lot of like the CrossFit gyms that we have now. The mentality they had, but also there's a circus community and the women in the gyms in the 70s. I love that you keep coming back to that. And I think that that's an important component that is missing a lot when people, I know personally for me, I did so many fad diets and so many of those, like, you know, Zumba and all the trendy things, which I have nothing against them, but doing something alone in your living room is way different than, you know, meeting up with the same people, and pushing each other and getting to know each other, and you become like a family. Like the gym I was going to, I'm not there anymore. So like last winter, my trainer had switched professions and got a job in the medical field, but there's a handful of us that still hang out and get together and like jog together, and we were working out together before the pandemic, and I think that's an important component, and always like such a good message. Find your community, not just in the gym, just in life. Find your community.
Absolutely. And I think that is, you mentioned CrossFit gyms. I think that's part of why they have become so popular. It's just, it creates that community that people want to be a part of.
We're nearing one. Did anyone have any final questions for Haley? You can type it in the chat or the question box.
One other thing I guess I just wanted to say is we've been talking a lot about fitness, which is obviously the message of, you know, one of the messages in the book, but you don't have to be a weightlifter or a power lifter or even have ever picked up a barbell to enjoy this book. It's really a book about history. It's a book about making the connections between what women have done in the past, like making some unusual connections. And it's about reconsidering our ideas of what we're capable of. And so you don't have to know what your bench press PR is in order to enjoy it, because it's really about something much broader than that.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. I do want to thank you again for coming and joining us. This has been awesome. If anyone's interested in Haley's book, Strong Like Her, we have copies at the New Haven Free Public Library that are available to borrow with your card for curbside pickup. So contact your local branch about that, and we will get you hooked up with a copy of the book. Haley, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, good luck on your splits.